All right, we are live. Welcome to Climate Courage, now in its second year. My name is Andrea Edwards, and our topic today is the fire age. We've lost Brad, unfortunately, and it was always a risk when we scheduled this. He's been deployed to fight a fire in Australia, so he's not able to join us, but that's okay, because Graeme is still able to be here. And Graeme, you caught my attention in the media during Australia's black fire season, which was one of the most catastrophic fire seasons in Australia's history. And you certainly were speaking truth to power at the time. And I was just relieved to see you out there, because, of course, that was when Prime Minister Scott Morrison was in the hot seat, and we know what happened there. But anyway, welcome. I'm so happy you agreed to join us. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, cool. Me too. Okay, so let's start with your story and your background, because I think that's a really important place to start.
Okay, what would you like me to say about that?
Well, go back into the fire history as well as what you're trying to achieve now.
Yep, sure. Look, I've been a firefighter for 41 years, joined as a recruit, and have been a passionate firefighter for all of those 41 years. Being a firefighter is both a pleasure and honour, but also it teaches you a lot about life and about both the tragedy and the triumph of life on both sides. And so for me, being a firefighter was great. I loved it the whole time, as do most firefighters, by the way. Probably, I don't know, 80 to 99% of firefighters love being a firefighter, even after they retire. They're still connected. And during that time as a firefighter, as a young firefighter, out there using something called a beaters, Andrea, and they were a long stick with 2 bars at the end, and the bars were held together with 2 flaps of canvas hose. And so you would walk along the fire edge, sometimes in front of the fire flames, beating the ground to try and blow the edge of the fire back into the fire. And you did that all day long, sometimes out in the bush. It was extraordinarily hard work. But like many others in the fire industry, in that 41 years, I've noticed the fires getting bigger, longer, hotter, more fierce. And certainly in the most recent period of time, those fires they're just exponential in a sense. So 41 years in the fire service, a career that spanned most of the ranks within the organisation and most of the areas within the organisation, fighting many bushfires, house fires, factory fires, chemical fires, being on deployments into other states because of their bushfire situations. A vast array of exciting experiences throughout the time. Loved it.
Yeah. And now your work, you've retired from fighting fires, and now what's your focus with your work?
Well, I'm still fighting fires in a sense, Andrea. I'm just fighting them in a different way. I'm not hanging on to the end of the hose anymore like I used to, and I kind of missed that as well, because it was exciting, dangerous but exciting work. Now I fight the fires partly through the business that I have with a whole range of speakers from emergency services that we can talk a bit more about later on. But part of that is then trying to fight the political fires and sometimes the bureaucratic fires that get in the way of putting the fires out better, quicker, faster, and with less resources. And we need to do that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. All right, so let's get stuck in. So I think it was in February, I saw an article, I think it was in the Australian Guardian, that was talking about Australia's going to be entering a really high fiery season, mainly because of grass fires. And it's obviously because of 3 years of La Nina and the floods and the detritus in the environment. And then since then, we've seen the whole catastrophe that's happened right across the northern hemisphere, not just with fire, but with heat, wet bulb temperatures, as well as floods. And it was only a few weeks ago that I started to feel that the media in Australia was really starting to sound the alarm about what was coming for Australia. So I suppose the first question is, what are you expecting for Australia in the coming months?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question, Andrea. Back in 2019, when I was heading over to Cambodia for a visit to Cambodia, I was driving down the Gold Coast, and it just was so strong, the emotion that that fire season was going to be bigger and worse than any other fire season. We'd been hearing about it and seeing it. And for that reason, I wrote to the Prime Minister at that time, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and said, look, we're in for a really bad fire season, along with other people who were warning the Prime Minister at the time as well, not just myself, many others, a number of others. And subsequently, that fire, the 2019-2020 fire, in excess of $10.2 billion worth of financial loss, and still escalating today as we speak. And that's not counting the new fires since 2019-20. That's just the 2019-20 fires. So I've got exactly that same feeling about the season this year. Now, there are divergent views. There are some people, and I was talking to a scientist recently that says that because of the floods, it will be too wet this season and it's a bit of a beat up. But what I'm saying about that is let's beat the beat up and make sure that if it isn't a beat up, that we're prepared for it. And I don't think we're fully prepared for it just yet. But I think this could be a bad season. Right.
Yeah. I mean, based on just what we've seen in the Northern Hemisphere, So I suppose the question is, there was some fires broke out in August, and I noticed that there was some very fast reaction to getting those fires out, which made me think, oh, maybe the thinking has shifted. How prepared do you think Australia is for the risks it's currently facing, and where or what do you think is the greatest risk?
Yeah, a couple of good questions there. Are we prepared? Are we preparing? The answer is yes. Are we prepared? Are we fully prepared? No, not at all. What's the greatest risk? The greatest risk is still apathy. And when I say apathy, Andrea, I mean apathy from the top right down to the bottom. The bottom, and I'm talking about the firefighters that are on the front line and the fire officers, that are leading those firefighters. Not so much apathy amongst those because they know what they're about to face, but there are layers of apathy all the way through. Now, when I talk about we're not prepared, I don't believe we are prepared. This is the analogy that I use, and you might hear me reference it a couple of times. Because of climate change, and I'm not going to go into the argument about whether it's man-made or otherwise, I have a strong view on that, but for the moment, we need to accept that climate change is here, that it's impacting upon us, and it's impacting hard and strong on the bushfire situation. And what that's like, as an analogy, is when the tanks arrived for the very first time on the battlefront in World War I, the enemy that they were fighting responded to them by doing things like making bayonets longer, by giving them more bullets, by trying out different bullets. It was rubbish. It wasn't until they met force with force that they started to overcome the enemy. The enemy that we're facing today is these bigger, larger, faster, fiercer fires that are being caused in large part, by climate change. So it's not until we address that issue, force with force, that we will be fully prepared. What we're doing at the moment, although we're doing a lot to make better bullets and longer bayonets, not addressing the force of the problem.
Yeah. So no money, more money has been invested in the infrastructure. Any of that happening?
Yes, there has. Last week or the week before, I was at the International Fire Conference, the Australasian Fire and Authorities Conference, and it's a combined conference of all of the fire authorities from around Australasia, and including Asian countries, but speakers and visitors from all around the world coming to it. And it's very clear, Andrea, that there is a lot being done. But the lot being done, in my opinion, at the moment, is still the better bullets and bayonets being done, not addressing the actual higher level issue. And the higher level issue is what to do about fire itself. And I can talk about that more if you want me to a bit later on.
Yeah. It's funny. I was we traveled up to Bangkok and back over the summer, our summer. And I was in this city called Hua Hin, which is just near Bangkok. And I was walking past the local fire station, but I actually thought it was a museum. because the trucks were so old. And I was like, what? And, you know, we saw what obviously happened in Hawaii, and there's reports about the drying out of the tropics and how they're not releasing the moisture and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot of countries in the world who potentially have never really faced fire. So I'm glad to hear that the Asian countries are being involved, but I think there's a lot of countries who've never faced fire that are going to be in for a rude shock in the coming years if we don't get climate change under control. But I want to continue with investment, because one of the early stories that came out of the Canada fires was there was this quick reaction force that used to go in and tackle the fires very quickly. And they, with the budget cuts, that team was removed, and they believed that because of that, those fires that started could have been put out faster with this team, and they weren't, because they took the budget away. So, you know, I mean, the sort of, when you look at the scale of the fires, I mean, they basically given up on a whole bunch of the fires in Canada and just had to let them burn. I mean, when I sort of think about potential investment, it must be 4, 5, 10 times what we're currently looking at. So, you know, where does the investment need to be? Not just in manpower, but also the technology that's required.
Okay, look, that's, to me, is a critical question. What should we be investing in? How much should we be investing in? Now, you have asked me, so I'm going to give you the answer that I believe is the critical answer to that question. When I said before that fire is the issue, what we are doing, Andrea, is we are spending considerable amounts of money, still nowhere near enough, but we are spending considerable amounts of money on addressing the problem of response to the fire and the consequences of fire. In fact, we're spending more, I believe, at the moment on the consequences of fire. So a fire starts, and then there's energy, and then there's smoke, and the smokes affect people, and it certainly does. You know, the smoke affects people with asthma. More people going to the hospitals during the 2019-25, huge numbers being affected just by the smoke. We're trying to make more resilient communities from fire and floods and other issues, but certainly with fire. And so huge amounts of money are being spent post the issue of a fire starting. Yeah. In my opinion, we need to be finding out more about fire itself, what fire is, and how to address the actual fire. So when I say the fire, I'm talking about the physics of fire, the chemistry of fire, right down, delving deep into the belly of the beast and looking at the quantum mechanics, the quantum physics of fire, to see if we can find a switch that switches it off. So to me, that's the first and critical and primary level of funding that needs to go in. Now, it cost Australia around about $10.2 billion for the 2019-20 fires, and still increasing. You imagine, if you will, for a moment, if we were to spend just $1 billion in Australia, or maybe $1 billion from the countries around the world who are also being affected by fire to the extent of billions of dollars, and pour that amount of money into a goal and set that goal at the highest political level internationally to eradicate, by the end of this decade, the effects of unwanted, uncontrolled fire. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you look at, say, the goal set by John F. Kennedy in 1962, when he stood in front of the Senate in America, and he said, "We will put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the decade." 1962. By 1969, Andrea, they had done it. They had done it by setting a high-level goal, bringing together a whole lot of scientists and people from every area of science to concentrate on that one top goal set at that top political level. If you look at somewhere like, many of your viewers might have heard of the CERN project. In Switzerland, France, a huge big underground circle where they were trying to prove, and have proved, that the last provable element in the universe, what they talk about, actually exists, the Higgs boson particle, or the Higgs boson element. And they smashed all those things together and proved that this thing actually exists. In excess of 10,000 scientists working collaboratively around the world on that one problem, and they solved it. Billions of dollars of investment. Let's do that as the very first project about fire. There's lots of other things that we should do and can do in addition to what we're already doing. But that first one, let's think about how to put the fire out right at the very beginning. So that would be the first area of investment. If we don't do that, Andrea, here's what we're doing at the moment in a sense. I used the analogy before of the tank and the bullets and the bayonets. The majority of money that we're spending is still on resilience. And resilience is great. I'm all in favor of it. But resilience is like this. Here's a cliff. Here's the big fire train coming along to the edge of the cliff. It's getting faster, and that train's getting bigger, and it's already gone over the cliff, and it's starting to smash at the bottom. And what we're doing, in a sense, is we're saying, let's make everything more resilient at the bottom of the cliff by having bigger and better ambulances, by making better roads to take them to hospital, have better sirens on the ambulances. No, we need to stop the fire train up here before it goes over the cliff. We've got to stop the fire, not just make things more resilient. And that's my issue about that.
I have this, Tanya sort of just left a comment. And Graham's one of the best, but I just lost track of it. But I've got this sort of idea that we need these innovation and research pods sort of spread around the world that focus on the big issues, because everything that we're doing is reactive. Every issue that we're dealing with it after the fact. And all politicians all around the world, everyone's scrambling to catch up, and we're seeing it with the floods that are going on at the moment. I mean, it's funny talking about fire at the moment because everyone's looking at the floods, but the fire is coming. But it feels just like there's no proactivity anywhere on any of the big issues that we face. And, fire is a really important one. All right. So we saw in Europe that they recently announced the creation of an EU fire force. And I know that globally you all sort of help each other and support each other and fly in and fly out. And there's a big sort of fraternity in the community. But so when it comes to the discussion that's happening globally amongst the fireys, because I think you're such a unique group of people. I went to a disaster exhibition, and the people who were doing fire weren't really interested in anyone who wasn't from that background. But what's the conversation? Have we gone too far already with fire? Is it just something that we're going to have to accept? Are we really just in the fire age, which is a heading I saw earlier this year? What's that conversation look like?
And the answer to that is no. We cannot, we will not, we must not, we dare not just think that we're living in the fire age. My fear is that that's actually what's starting to happen a little bit. Although, as you mentioned in the beginning there, the media are picking up on it. They know the fire season is coming. So, for their own purposes, they're starting to not beat it up, because it doesn't need beating up, but they're starting to promote the issue that there is this significant fire disaster that may be looming upon us. But we shouldn't start, again, it's the apathy issue that I started. In a sense, the greatest enemy is apathy. It's like, we're in the fire age now. We've got to hunker down and bear with it and be more resilient about it. No, let's be proactive and let's do the research. And when I mentioned the research before about fire, the other thing that we can do, by the way, and as a firefighter, I've used water to put out fires for 41 years. And guess what, Andrea? We don't yet know enough about water. The reason that we use water is because, generally speaking, it's in abundance, because we put it in huge pipes in the streets so that we can fight fires in domestic and residential areas. And we've got it in ponds and streams and other places where we can pick it up in these reasonably tiny little buckets and drop it on, and it hardly does anything to the fires. But we're not putting enough concerted, cooperative effort into researching water. So on the one hand, there are, the ancient Greeks, 4 elements earth, fire, water, and wind. And we're not putting research into the fire and the water part. Water has got a huge thermal capacity. That means if you take a little bit of it, it takes a huge amount of energy to convert that water. It absorbs a lot of energy before it will turn into steam. And even the steam, when you have it in a fire, it's excluding the oxygen. So it has this dual purpose. But the size of the bushfires that we've got, Andrea, and we pick up a bucket of water, or we have an aeroplane, and Queensland's just got one of the biggest and best aeroplanes, but it's still like cutting across a huge 1 kilometre high fire flame, and it's like, and it's not doing enough. It's doing better, but it's not doing enough. So we need to invest in fire, and we need to invest in water. You imagine if we could find a way with water to increase, through quantum physics, to increase the thermal capacity of water so that it absorbed double the amount of energy or triple, or we put other stuff into the water and fired it onto the fire zone. These things would have greater impact if we did the research that you're talking about and put significant amounts of money into doing the research that might give us the outcome, not around the edges.
Hopefully after this year, we're going to do that. So one of the really big issues around fire, and I think many people are missing this in the wider discussion on fire, is, as we're seeing in Canada, all the smoke goes north into the Arctic and it dumps brown carbon on the ice, which increases ice melt and is accelerating us towards the blue ocean event, which of course creates more warming. More warming means more fires. So that's the tipping point, right? So we're past this tipping point. So drastic sort of attention needs to be paid. So as far as the discussion goes in the firefighting fraternity, is it more about just dealing with the issue, or is that bigger picture sort of multiple layers of impact being discussed as well?
That's a really good question as well. Let me answer it by saying that there are a number of layers of thinking and layers of culture within the fire and emergency services organisations, from my experience at least. The first one is this: firefighters love to fight fires. Almost, for some of them and for some cultures within the fire services, almost everything else is extraneous. Almost everything else is, but I want to fight the fires. That's my job. I want to fight the fires. So there is a culture of that for some, maybe even for many. As you move into the different layers of the organisation, a greater awareness of the impacts of the environmental issues and the climate issues impact departmentally, financially, bureaucratically on the higher levels of organisations. And so they become much more aware of it. But there is still the vested interest, and I'm on interesting ground here, there is still the vested interest in the bigger, better fires that there are, the bigger, better budget you will get to fight them. If you address the problem, it's a little bit like polio. When they made polio go away, there were thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people out of work that were in work prior to the polio inoculations being developed. If you put fire out too soon, too quick, it's not a conscious thing, but it is a subconscious thing, in my opinion, that goes on through these organisations, right up to, and I'm not saying our minister, state or federal, but it can be good for a minister to be on the news talking about disasters. If there were no disasters or fires, you wouldn't have that minister on the news or at the cabinet table so much as they might otherwise be. So there are layers of awareness and layers of a desire to be involved and layers of a desire to fully commit to solving the problem for those reasons.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective I've never heard before. We've got Alexander here. We are still recovering from the fires in Hawaii, and obviously we all saw a terrible, terrible situation. And realising that these are an unanticipated occurrence in an area surrounded by water, our situations are much more desperate than we anticipated. And you read a lot about, the grass that was in Hawaii from the early colonial sort of movement where they brought in sugarcane and those sort of things. But I mean, it was just a tragedy in an area that I don't think we would expect that sort of level of fire, right?
No. Completely shocked me. But I think upon that in some ways like this, Andrea. Throughout my fire career, I've heard many people say things like, but I live in a concrete building or a concrete apartment, so I'm safe, it's not going to burn down. And it's quite a strange thinking, but not strange if that's what you believe. If you believe that you're safe on an island, then that's strange thinking to me as a firefighter, but it may not have been to those people on the island. Now, as you're probably aware, there is some suggestion that there could have been a lot more done prior to that particular fire across a whole range of issues. It doesn't detract from the tragedy of what did happen, but to me, if we do what I was talking about earlier, in the future, we should not have that tragedy happening again in our future.
Yeah, so many mistakes. So I want to get on to the heat, because while the fire conversation in Australia has certainly started, we had wet bulb temperatures here in Thailand in April, and it was very, very uncomfortable. So basically from February to April, we had the haze from the fires burning up north coming down, which made it even worse, and it was revolting. And obviously in Australia in the coming season, it's not just fire risk, but it's also the extreme heat that is expected. We've seen some shocking stories coming out of the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, just the people falling over and getting third-degree burns within seconds, because the pavement's so hot. But also, with El Nino coming up, we've got record ocean temperatures now, which won't hit their peak until March next year. There's a potential that Australia, I actually can't find the temperature expectations in Australia, the predictions in Australia. I haven't been able to find it, and trust me, I look for it. But we could well and truly go beyond 50 degrees C, as we've been seeing around the world. So, if the heat, I know obviously the firefighters are used to heat, but if it gets beyond 50 degrees C, can the crews even work? And then what about the machinery, the technology? I've been reading about, at what temperature things start to stop working or start to destabilize. In roads in Greece, their electricity is underground, and it collapsed because of the heat at about 48.9 degrees Celsius. So, what's that preparation? Is it being factored in? Or?
That's a really interesting question. Let me answer it by referring back again to the AFAC conference. One of the presentations was about what Australia could expect by the year 2050, and based on the best science of these people coming together at the conference to put forward these issues. So the question that I posed to the presenter, it was a great presentation. So in 2032, Brisbane will be hosting, or Queensland will be hosting the Games. And given the predictions that they're now making, just up to 2032, let alone beyond, what are we doing as Queensland and as other states to prepare for the massive heat increase that's going to occur, that's predicted to occur? What are we doing for our infrastructure in Queensland and Brisbane to prepare the people that are going to come into Queensland for the Games, and for the people that already live here and will continue to live here? And it wasn't a complete silence, but might have been somewhat of a stunned silence initially, and it's almost like a mirror response. We'll look into that and get back to you, because I'm not sure that at least the people who are doing the presentation had thought that through to that particular point. But It is the issue that by 2032, and the lead up to 2032 and post 2032, the temperatures that they're saying are going to continue to increase. So let me go back to your question about the firefighters, because it's a really interesting one. As I said before, firefighters love fighting fires. They live, breathe, wanting to fight fires, to help their communities. It's it's a glorious thing when it's in action. Temperatures have been increasing for a while now. And one of the things that we did going back a little way was we started to put our firefighters in air-conditioned fire appliances. And the fire appliances from when I started, a long time ago, compared to now, are vastly different. But at one stage, we started to give them air conditioning. And so particularly up north, in the north of Queensland, what we were finding was that if they had to go a reasonable distance to get to the fire, in their air conditioning, as soon as they got out of the fire appliance and faced the heat outside in the day, as well as the heat from the fire, boom, they were just getting smacked in the face by it. And so we had a number of firefighters falling over from it. And so we had to address that by trying to adjust the temperatures to make sure that they were safe inside the cab, and as soon as they got out and started fighting the fire as well. So a couple of things. The first one is that the firefighting uniforms they wear have gradually improved. Are they the best at the moment? No, that argument is still going on, that debate about what's the best kind of uniform for them to wear at structural fires and at bushfires is still going on. A lot better than when I first joined now, but still not perfect. So that's one issue. It still needs lots of investment and improvement. The other issue is that, as you mentioned, the appliances, the fire appliances, although they're improving, I'm not convinced at this stage that we are preparing in a mechanical sense, a fuel sense, getting ready for the extreme temperatures that we're going to face. And that's in two areas. The first area is the petrol combustion engines. And then if we start swapping over to green energy, if we start going over to electric engines, the issue about how the increased temperatures will then affect the power grids and the power stations that are using the green energy also needs to be addressed as well. So we're going to have to be looking at both these combustion engines and these electric vehicles in a different way, getting ready for that increase in temperature. Otherwise, we will be in the position that you're talking about, where the fire engine might not get to the fire in the first place, or the chopper in the air, or the aircraft. So it is a big issue that I don't think we've fully addressed just yet.
I based on going through wet bulb temperatures, I put together a guide on what we can do as individuals, as communities, and then some of the bigger issues. And so I was doing a lot of research. So solar panels can last till 62 degrees Celsius. So they're pretty stable as long as you don't have hailstones. Generators start basically not working very well once you get above 40 degrees. Like we were talking about, under 50 degrees, we saw in roads the electricity fall when it was underground. So here I am in Thailand, all the electricity is above ground, right? In India, in these extreme heat temperatures, the electricity cables start to sag, and of course they start fires. But even roads, how the roads have been built for heat. And I know in Australia it's probably built more than any other country for heat, but we're moving into new heat territory. So like even the fire trucks being able to get to the fires if the road melts is, that's an issue that concerns me. So that really hasn't started happening at scale yet.
No, and I think that will start to dawn on the community as well as the emergency services as time goes on. I mean, even a number of years back, I can remember driving on roads, the old tar seal roads, the old tarmac roads, where that tar seal was just melting, and the tyres, you could hear them sticking as the wheels were going around. And that was temperatures back then. Yeah. That up a few more degrees, and we've got a lot to think about.
Yeah. It's sort of a bit alarming that we're still thinking about it, right? Alexander again is just sort of talking about the First Nations people, and he's absolutely right. The most knowledgeable people on earth as far as climate management and sustainability, especially in the Australian environment, which is unique. So let's go on to that question. Are they finally getting a voice? Obviously, not the voice, but and a role in fighting fires in Australia, or have we left that too late for this season?
Okay, two parts of the question there. Let me address the last part first. Is it too late? In my opinion, it's never too late. We must and we will keep trying. Is there an increasing role for the Indigenous culture and history and experience and knowledge to be brought much more into land management? Hell yes, absolutely. We would be stupid to ignore thousands upon thousands of years of experience in dealing with the fire. But here's the counterpoint to that. Let me say first, before I say the counterpoint, we need to adopt and adapt what the Indigenous people have been telling us for a long time and are currently telling us. And almost all fire services throughout Australia, and maybe in other countries like Canada and America, I'm not sure, but certainly in Australia, are now engaging with their Indigenous communities much more. Some have already done it quite a lot, and engaging with them much more to learn from, bring them into the tent and work with them to solve the fire problem. But here's the counterpoint to that in a sense. In Queensland, we have what we call the I zone. A friend of mine, prior Commissioner Lee Johnson, coined the phrase, from my memory. It's the same sort of thing in every state, in every country, right around the world. And it's where the bushland abuts up to the living environment, to the structural environment, whether that's a building or many buildings, a row of streets backing onto the bush. So in Queensland, we call it the I zone. It's that zone between the estate, the buildings, and the bushland. So it's like all other disasters. It's like floods and cyclones and the other things. If we didn't have human beings building where they built, we wouldn't have disasters.
Mm.
But because we keep building up to the bush, we will always have these issues. So although the Aboriginal, the Indigenous land management is great, it's town planning and it's councils and state organisations and nationally that have got to address this issue about the I zone and what it's called in other states, but the same thing, the I zone issue, and how far back we might need to go if we're going to build our buildings into that bushland area. How far back do we need to go back into the bush to give that buffer zone, that I zone, the level of safety that it needs, given the increases in temperature and severity and all the rest of that's going on with the fires. So yeah, it's both. We need to bring in the Indigenous people much more and use their knowledge and experience, but also where they can't assist in that abutting area because the communities keep moving. We need to address both of those issues.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've never heard of the I zone. So I grew up in Wodonga, Victoria. Do you know Wodonga?
Lovely word. Yeah.
Yeah, I played in the local brass band, and outside was where the volunteer firefighters used to practice every year. So certain times a year they were there running up and down the ladders and doing all their work. And one of the things that I keep thinking as I'm watching Australia move towards more and more severe fires is that the volunteer firefighters, we need to obviously ramp that up, but also just general education in the community. And when I'm reaching out to my family and friends saying, are you prepared? One thing that seems to have come through strongly, because, I left Australia in 1995. I've sort of been back and forth, but really I left in 1995. I feel that the average Australia, especially in the country, they're much more switched on to fire and fire preparation. They know their pathways out. My dad used to live in the Kiwa Valley, and that fires used to come through that every year. And so most Australians seem to be switched on. But what more could Australians be doing as a community, like getting out into the environment, cleaning up the mess that's been left by the floods, or what more could the community be doing to prepare for this before it really strikes?
Yeah, and again, a couple of things come to my mind there. The first one is the issue about volunteerism. Australia is one of the great countries in the world where we have had and still have significant numbers of volunteers. The Queensland Fire and Emergency Services runs to a large extent on our volunteer forces, 35, 40,000 volunteers, one of the biggest volunteer groups in Australia. We need to continue to make sure that there is something for the volunteers to make sure that they're achieving in doing their volunteer work. And a part of that is doing all the things that you're talking about. It's getting out into the community and talking to those that aren't as aware of those that are in the volunteer service. And what I mean by that is as that I zone keeps encroaching, as we keep developing new suburbs and new locations out in the country, and we have city people going out into the country, the city people don't know because they haven't been as aware in the middle of the city suburb as they should be when they go out into a country area. The country people, as you say, they're already aware and they know their areas, but it's the city people coming out. So the volunteers have got to engage with both. But even some of the country folk, Andrea, can get a little bit apathetic. I'm not talking about the volunteers, but those that are out there that may not have thought through what will happen with the greater severity of the fires. In particular, are things like, and it's probably only been the last, 5 to 10 years that this has become such a big issue, the means of escape out of and the access for fire appliances and volunteers and permanent firefighters to go into their particular property. So that's one issue. The second issue is the animals. A lot of people in the country, a lot of city people going into the country naturally have this concern with their animals and want to protect their animals. And often, particularly pets, they want to take them out of that fire zone area to a place of safety. So in the last probably 10 years, Australia has started to set up these designated safe zones. So for people living in the country or for people going into the country, it's how do I make sure that the fire appliances can get into my property to fight the fire? How can I get out of the property? And where will I go when I'm out of my property to a safe zone? And so, for example, in Queensland sets up these safe zones, these areas, sometimes in a school, for example, out in the football field, that might be a safe zones that you've got access in. You can protect the people that are in there, and sometimes you'll have the pets and other animals coming into that area with them. So there's a lot of thought about a broader aspect in addition to what they should be thinking about, which is how do I protect myself in my farm, my location, my house, and what's around that. So it's broader than that now, but it certainly still should include their own environment.
So making sure people get educated on what that is and where they can go, and to the whole traffic side, which is obviously critical. We're seeing the traffic implications in so many areas. Yes. In Canada, I mean, those evacuations way up north near the Arctic Circle. So
smoke going across the road again. I mean, a classic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So one of my huge frustrations, and I know it is for you too, based on watching you speak last year, is the media hype around the cause of fire being arson. Now, once again, we've been hearing it all year. It's arson started the fire. So now we all know that humans start fires. Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes it's carelessness. Sometimes it's because a glass was left behind that got so hot it starts a fire, right? But it also nature starts fires too, like lightning strikes. So, but I just feel so frustrated by it. So no matter how a fire starts, it's the state that the environment's in that matters, because that's where the acceleration starts. So we're going to get this story again. Oh, it's people throwing out cigarette butts, or it's people intentional arsonists, which every country has them. And we know that the Murdoch press is going to go nuts for it, like they did last time. But can you just give me a definitive answer for that I can share? Because I'm so sick of it coming up. Because to me, it's like it's obvious why we're having these extreme fires and accelerated fires, because the environment is changing, because it's warming and it's drier. And however it starts, it's the state that matters, the state that it's in. Any one-liners you can give me? Or 10?
I don't know about one-liners. Okay, so the first thing to say is that when you think about the bushland in particular, the bushland either has roads that run alongside the bush or that go into the bush. So yes, there are fires that start from arson, But the majority of those fires that start from arson are in those accessible places. And they're not the majority of fires that a country experiences. The majority of fires, from my recollection, is from the lightning strikes, not from arson.
Okay.
Arson's bad, and in my opinion, because of the consequences of the fires that are started by arson, even though they might be responded to and extinguished quicker than the ones in the middle of the bush, the consequences are often more significant. And so the penalties for arson fires, I think, need to be ramped up. And when I was in the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, we did that, but I still think that they can go up much more, because there needs to be significant, because of the conditions that you're talking about, because of the environment that we're now in, where because of the climate change, things are hotter, faster, bigger and worse than the fires previously. Commensurate with that should then be the punishment for it because of the consequences on the communities that it affects.
Yeah.
So that's the first issue. The second issue for me is, because of the environment that we're now facing, both from the heat that's occurring, but also the vegetation, is that when I mentioned before that I believe the investment should be in the front end on what fire is and how to switch it off, and what water is and how to make better use of it. I also believe that there is, at the moment, although it can get better, at the moment, in my opinion, there is no reason why we can't detect, respond to, and either extinguish or sufficiently contain a fire so that it doesn't get any larger than 10 cubic meters approximately. And we've got algorithms from satellites that can pick up, the size of a fire. So we should be able to detect it, respond to it, and extinguish or contain it within 1 hour, irrespective of the geographical location of that fire in Australia. And if we can do that, we will prevent things like the fires that burned out. I can't remember the number exactly, but it was about 200 or something fires, houses. I might have got that too big. It burned out a huge number of houses in Canberra, but it started in a remote area, way out in the bushland, a hard to get to place. But even those hard to get to places, we can now do something about it. We can detect it and we can get to it with the resources that we've currently got. Much more difficult, but we can do it, and we ought to be doing it because of the environment that we're in. And we let them get too big, they'll burn out residential areas again.
There's quick reactive forces, right? So Alexander has just asked a question here. What is being done to address the long-term dangers and to address and hopefully stop the deteriorating situation of climate change? The concerns must address not only the risk to human life, but to the delicate ecological system as well. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, and I'd reference the report that went into, and it made 82 recommendations coming out of the 2019-2020 fires, talking about the loss of the amount of environmental damage, the loss of life from the animals.
Over 1 billion, right?
Yeah, it was just extraordinary. So when you reference that report, it's online, it's available. Now, things have been set up since that, but that does clearly identify exactly what that question's about. Is enough being done? Now, back in that report, it said not enough was being done. The question that remains now is, in 2023, is enough being done? And from what I've already said, I don't believe there is enough being done just yet.
Yeah, no, I certainly took that away, which is, I'm an Australian. I'm not in Australia, but my family and my friends are in Australia, so I'm certainly aware of that. So I like to think ahead and try and make sense of the big picture and try and work out what's coming. And one of the biggest issues I think that we're facing is heat. I've just bought the book, The Heat Will Kill You First. And, like I said, we've experienced wet bulb temperatures where I live, which was a first. I was just reading about a child in the US who was forced to run when it was 36 degrees Celsius, and they died in the heat. We saw in Phoenix, we've seen, the actual numbers of deaths from heat will not be known because so many other things can, be attributed. But one of the curiosities for me, and I asked Google the question, at what point does it get so hot that eucalyptus leaves self-combust? And
got an answer, Andrea. I'd love to hear it.
I couldn't find an answer to the question, right? Because, of course, for those who aren't Australian, eucalyptus is oil, and that's why the Australian fires can be so bad. But I did find lots of information about how once on fire, as I'm sure you know, eucalyptus trees do explode due to the oil. And there is a push around the world where gum trees are not native, so places like Chile and California, where they're actually looking at getting rid of all of the gum trees. And that's just an interesting topic in itself, and how eucalyptus trees have proliferated around the world. Obviously, that's not something we're going to be able to do in Australia. That is the ecosystem that we have. So do you know the answer to the question? Is it an issue? Is it something we should be thinking about? Because I can imagine that if this is something that we've never faced before, is it a risk or is it not a risk? And I could imagine that if it is a risk, where if the temperature just gets so hot, the trees start exploding, we've pretty much got no chance. So any thoughts there, just to help my curious mind?
Look, I think there will be some scientific evidence about, certainly about the flammability limits with the eucalypt oil. And when it's really hot and it's vaporizing, it's vaporizing off the leaves, and so it sets up a cloud, if you will, of vapors that are if are ignited, then become incredibly rapid fire spreaders, particularly in and you may have heard the term before, the crowning at the top of the trees. Yep. So as those gases are being given off by the eucalypt plants, it can form this kind of a cluster of a cloud of flammable vapor. And so once the fire gets up into that area, sometimes because of that reason, not the only reason, but sometimes because of that reason, you get what's called crowning of the fire. And that's where the fire is not down below, it's actually racing ahead of the fire that's down below, because it's crowning across the top of the trees. And for firefighters, and in fact for anybody in their homes in the bushland area, that can be extraordinarily dangerous, because they see the fire down below, but it's not until the fire comes up and crowns, and either comes behind them and traps them, or races in front of them and traps them and starts dropping all of the embers, etc., because it's crowned through the top of the trees. And a lot of the eucalypt types of trees actually do that. But there will be scientists that will know the actual temperatures at which those things would become that volatile.
So is it the higher the temperature, the more the vapor comes out, or is it? Yeah.
Yes.
So it could be a double whammy this year with your increased heat. You've got these clouds, and also you've got all the stuff on the ground that's ready to burn. So it could be a double whammy, right?
Yes, and that's why fire services, including the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, in the cold season, they want to do their back burning, so that to make sure that the stuff down the bottom won't burn as much or as hot, but also to stop it then getting up into the top layers. So the cold burns during the winter months, which then sometimes cause lots of smoke and people complain about and go to hospital with asthma, but it's catch-22. We need to do that in the cold months to stop what's potentially going to happen in the really hot months, partly because of that issue, significantly because of that issue. Yeah.
Okay, so double whammy on the way. All right. So before I ask you the final question, I want you to talk a little bit more about your business, because I know you recently set up a speakers bureau, and I just want you to just share with everyone what you offer, so that people can reach out to you. You've got the contact information here on the screen.
Well, thank you for that opportunity, Andrea. Can I finish off on that goal first, though?
Yeah. Yep.
Right, that goal to eradicate uncontrolled fire by the end of this decade. So the proposal has 4 projects. The first project is to do that research into fire, so that we can look at the quantum mechanics of it, go right down to that depth and figure out what fire is and hopefully switch it off. Now, I mentioned the CERN project with in excess of 10,000 scientists. Imagine pulling together the same number of scientists in fire-related fields, 10,000 scientists, just with that one goal. Imagine how extraordinarily powerful that would be and what would come out of it, the fringe benefits that would come out of it, let alone the ability to switch off fire. So that's the first project, is to get this collaborative effort of scientists. The second project is then to say, okay, we're looking at the deep into the belly of fire, but what about what will put the fire out? So the second project is to pull together a whole range of scientists and experts in industry and in government and look at what better things, other than the ones we're already using, can be pulled together to put fires out right now. So that's the second project, the second collaborative project. The third project, and for me, this is quite a critical one. When I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast about the tank and the bayonets and the bullets, we talk about fire as an enemy. Now, it's a friend and an enemy. There's a Latin phrase, ignis est servus non dominus, which means fire is the servant, not the master, which, as we know, with these bushfires, is just bull dust. The fires are so big now that they are the master and we're just following along after them a lot of the time. So if fire truly is the enemy, as far as these uncontrolled, unwanted bushfires are concerned, let's treat it like the enemy and let's use military-style tactics, tools, and strategies to address it. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is let's start using things like Black Hawk helicopters with rockets loaded with fire extinguishing stuff. But stuff that currently exists and stuff that they're going to develop in this second project. Let's start using things like bullets full of the extinguishing material and firing them the full length of a fire zone instead of just dropping a Bambi bucket full of water in one spot or trying to cut through a fire zone that's 2 kilometres long or 10 kilometres long and 1 kilometre high. We need to use military strategies, tools, tactics, and think differently about putting the fires out than we currently are. So using the military for it. That's the third one. The fourth one, a lot of work is being done in this already, but more needs to be done. The fourth one is to bring together all of the technology that we currently know about, but do it in a collaborative effort so that we can achieve that goal of detecting a fire. Now, we can do that through satellites, we can do it through drones, we can do it through fixed-wing aircraft, we can do it from cameras up on top of hills, triangulate or quadrangulate where that fire is. The algorithms will tell you whether it's a campfire or whether it's getting out of control, pinpoint it, put the resources directly to it no matter where it is, and put that fire out and then mop up with ground forces as quickly as possible. So the fourth project is to get this IT technology, AI, virtual reality availability and put it together as a collaborative effort, internationally as well as nationally. So these are 4 projects that hopefully would get us to eradicate uncontrolled fire by the end of the decade. So that's the 4 projects and that's the goal. Needs to be set at that high political level, Andrea.
And how's it going? Like, what's the momentum there? Because it sounds like it's actually
ministers. I've presented at conferences. It is a fire ceiling. It's not a glass ceiling. It's a fire ceiling. It's a But we'll keep going because it's worth going because of what's going on. So your question about the Speakers Bureau. So the Speakers Bureau, Andrea, it's unique in the sense that all of the speakers are speakers that come from the front line of emergency services, military and medical. So firefighters, police, SES, surf lifesaving, all of the emergency services, as well as Army, Navy, Air Force, and doctors and nurses, people that live and breathe responding to emergencies. And they're all leaders in their field, and they're all great speakers who can address such a broad range of issues, including leadership and management, but also the issues about climate change. So they're all great speakers. And so if you've got a conference coming up and you're looking for a great speaker, give me a call. Can I say one other thing too, by the way? About
Absolutely.
Lifesavers just popped into my head. One of the presentations at the conference was from a friend of mine, Steve Pearce. He's the CEO of the New South Wales Surf Lifesavers. And during the floods, the last lot of floods, the surf lifesavers, who have now been accredited in New South Wales as an emergency response support organisation, assisted all of the other volunteers inland up rivers to help out in the floods. These were surf lifesavers, thousands of them. So that collaborative effort again, it is truly all about collaboration and joining the forces together to fight the force that we're fighting at the moment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm all about collaboration and community and everyone getting trained. So let's just wrap it up. Your 4 goals give me hope. Like, one of the things that I'm hoping for is, so BOM, Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, they haven't actually said that El Nino has started yet. NOAA, the American one, has said it started. So if it hasn't started, I think there's a chance this fire season might not be as drastic, but the following season will definitely be, if El Nino starts, according to BOM. So it's a bit of a confusing conversation out there, because people are talking that El Nino has started, but the country that's closest to where the measurements are actually happening have said it hasn't begun yet. So let's just keep an eye on it. But we know that, El Nino takes 6 to 9 months before it really gets intense. So that's why Australia's looking really, really bad. What can Australians do? Because of course this isn't just Australia, but as the people who are next on the front line of extreme fire risk, like what would be your message to Australia right now, apart from getting behind your 4 points and voting for politicians and convincing politicians that we need to go hard and go big on this? What would you say?
Yeah, you may have heard of a phrase called the tipping point, Andrea.
Yeah.
And the tipping point across any subject is when a prevailing frame of mind exists, whether it's in a classroom with 30 kids or whether it's in the United Nations on a particular cultural subject. A change occurs when a tipping point is reached. And the tipping point is normally around about 30% of whatever the numbers are that you're dealing with. So as quickly as possible, I believe we need to achieve a tipping point in relation to the one issue that you and I have been talking about, which is the bushfire issue, which is contributing enormously to the impact of climate change and contributing to climate change because of the outcomes of the fires and the browning and the smoke, etc. So we need to talk to each other about it. We need to talk to our politicians about it. We need to get to that tipping point so that people from all levels of society realize that this is such a critical issue that it will impact on them if they don't do something about it, and that together we need to do something about it. Because if we don't, and I don't know about you, but I understand why it's said and I agree with it being said, but at the same time, I am so sick and tired of hearing people say, our thoughts and our prayers are with you. I want action. Thoughts and the prayers are great, but I want action. And so we need to get to that tipping point. Climate change is much bigger than bushfires, but bushfires is a huge part of it and a significant part of it. So we need the tipping point to change our thinking and to get the funding and to get the research and to get the resources to then do something better. Yeah.
So it really continues to be, we the people, our power is our voice in speaking up, in normalizing conversations, and drowning out the nonsense. There's so much nonsense, and one of the messages that I always share is, if you are an expert in a field, you've got to be involved on social media. You've got to be involved in the conversation, even if you think the conversation's too ugly and you don't want to be part of it. You've got to be part of it, because a small percentage of people have been dominating the social landscape for a long time now, negatively, and we need the good people speaking up. We also need to normalise it, and we need to vote for leaders who've got the strength and the courage and aren't being funded by the people creating who are causing the problem. So it's big, it's complex, but we're not powerless, right? And your 4 points, I was going to say when you shared your goal, it's the first time I felt hope that if we can get enough people to hear what you're saying and get this message out there, I think it was the first time I've heard that it's possible, that we can. It's not just going to keep escalating and escalating, because every escalation creates more and more and more, and then we're in runaway territory. And obviously a lot of people think we already are, but listening to what you said, I think that sounds like there's a chance that we could do this. If we can solve the fire issue, we can solve so many of the others and start to bring the escalation down, which is what we desperately need to do, right?
Mm.
All right. So for those who are listening and not watching, how do they get in touch with you?
IESSB, the International Emergency Services Speakers Bureau. It's a website. They can look me up on LinkedIn. I think you might have shared your LinkedIn connection with me, so they can get me via LinkedIn. Graeme Thom. It has got AFSM at the end because there are a number of other Graeme Thoms, so that's just to differentiate, to delineate. So Graeme Thom.
You stand out with your hat on.
Well, thank you. I need it. Yeah. So via LinkedIn, Graeme Thom. That's GRAEME. Or the website, International Emergency Services Speakers Bureau, iessb.com.au. Give me a call. I'll be going to Cambodia for a little while, so my phone number will change, but that website and the LinkedIn will get me.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're going to be pretty busy with the media soon, so I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting the fight. When I see you putting stuff out there, I'll support it. And we've got to get ahead and stop reacting to. And that's with fire, it's with floods, preparation, it's with everything that we're facing, right? We're always behind, and our politicians are always on the back foot, and we've all got to get on the front foot. So really appreciate you spending the time with us, and hopefully I'll meet you at some point at one of our industry meetings. But really appreciate your time. Thanks, Graeme.
Thank you for the opportunity, Andrea. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, guys.